This is part 3 of chapter 78. Morgan was on quite another tack. His inquiry aimed to be scientific and was worldwide. His questions had no obvious practical use. When he returned from his business trip to Michigan, he composed a 7-page printed questionnaire with more than 200 questions on every aspect of tribal organization, kinship, customs, and usage. From the name used to designate a person's father, to the name, quote, of the daughter of a brother, to the son of the brother's sister, end of quote. Using the franking privilege of the congressman from Aurora, Morgan sent out the questionnaires to missions and federal agencies in the American West. His covering letter explained that the answers would help, quote, solve the question whether our Indians are of Asiatic origin, end of quote. Some recipients were too busy. Others were not interested because they already believed, quote, Mr. Louis Agassiz right in pronouncing them, like the buffalo and grizzly bear, indigenous, end of quote. But scores of respondents sent in detailed reports of the Dakotas, Shawnees, Omahas, and Pueblos. Morgan's own field trip to Kansas and Nebraska yielded 11 schedules in 11 languages, nearly all with clear resemblances to the Iroquois system. One day, Morgan received from a missionary in South India a chart of the Tamil kinship system identical with that of the Iroquois. He rushed to show the good news to a scholarly friend, who reported that Morgan had turned purple with excitement. Now, Morgan saw it was, quote, imperative to include the entire human family within the scope of the research, end of quote. And so he did, with the cooperation of Joseph Henry, the Smithsonian Institution, and the Foreign Service of the United States. Henry printed Morgan's charts under the Smithsonian letterhead and used the Smithsonian mailing privilege to send them around the world. The Secretary of State instructed American diplomats everywhere to cooperate in the study. In January 1860, Morgan's circular went out to all continents, and by spring, he had received 200 completed questionnaires. In 1870, after countless revisions and abridgments to satisfy the cautious Joseph Henry, quote, that its value should be fully established, end of quote, even before it was published, the Smithsonian Institution finally published Morgan's 600-page book on Systems of Consanguinity and Affinity of the Human Family. Morgan's conclusion, supported by facts from everywhere, was that two basically different modes of reckoning kinship were found in the world, and most of the peoples on the planet could be classified into one or the other. Linguists had never succeeded in establishing such large distinctions, but Morgan now showed that the Indo-European and Semitic nations had one type of kinship system, while other peoples had the other. He then argued that the similarity of the American Indian and the Asian systems of kinship established an Asiatic origin for the American Indians. Quote, when the discoverers of the New World bestowed upon its inhabitants the name of the Indians under the impression that they had reached the Indies, they little suspected that children of the same original family, although upon a different continent, stood before them. By a singular coincidence, error was truth, end of quote. Many anthropologists now do not subscribe to Morgan's thesis, but they still draw on his precious facts about societies that would soon disappear. Morgan's unprecedented effort produced only a sample of the raw material to be found everywhere for a new science of mankind, but it was an enticing sample. While Las Casas had insisted that mankind was one and equal in the sight of God, Morgan discovered the common experience of all mankind. Primitive peoples, no longer relics of sin or symbols of decadence, became clues to what all mankind had once been. When Morgan read Darwin, at first he resisted the idea of the emergence of species by evolution, but, quote, after working up the results from consanguinity, I was compelled to adopt the conclusion that man commenced at the bottom of the scale from which he worked himself up to his present status, end of quote. This was Morgan's own version of evolution. How man, quote, works himself up, end of quote, was the theme of his ancient society, or researches in the lines of human progress from savagery through barbarism into civilization. 1877. He might have called it, quote, a treatise on human progress, end of quote, for he showed that everywhere civilization had advanced by similar steps. Quote, growth of intelligence through inventions and discoveries, growth of the idea of government, growth of the idea of the family, and growth of the idea of property. These were the means of human advance. Just as Thompson had parsed prehistory, Morgan went on to describe the three grand epochs of all human development, which were still visible in the arrested development of some societies. He saw them all in the mirror of his America. Quote, the latest investigations respecting the early condition of the human race are tending to the conclusion that mankind commenced their career at the bottom of the scale and worked their way up from savagery to civilization through the slow accumulations of experimental knowledge. Portions of the human family have existed in a state of savagery, other portions in a state of barbarism, and still other portions in a state of civilization. So these three distinct conditions are connected with each other in a natural as well as necessary sequence of progress. End of quote. Technology and the arts of subsistence distinguished the periods and marked the progress of humankind. In savagery, mankind lived by gathering fruits and nuts, learned to fish and use fire, and invented the bow and arrow. In barbarism, mankind invented the art of pottery, learned to domesticate animals and to cultivate plants, began to use adobe and stone in house building, and finally learned to smelt iron and use iron tools. Civilization began with the invention of the phonetic alphabet and climaxed in all the 19th century wonders. Quote, the principal contributions of modern civilization are the electric telegraph, coal gas, the spinning jenny, the power loom, the steam engine with its numerous dependent machines, including the locomotive, the railway, and the steamship, the telescope, the discovery of the ponderability of the atmosphere and of the solar system, the art of printing, the canal lock, the mariner's compass, and gunpowder. The mass of other inventions, such, for example, as the Ericsson propeller, will be found to hinge upon one or another of those named as antecedents, but there are exceptions, as photography. With these also should be removed the modern sciences, religious freedom in the common schools, representative democracy, constitutional monarchy with parliaments, the feudal kingdom, modern privileged classes, international statute and common law. Modern civilization recovered and absorbed whatever was valuable in the ancient civilizations. End of quote. Morgan's own vivid experience of progress had nourished his optimism and made him a prophet and a founder of a science of progress. Quote, the theory of human degradation to explain the existence of savages and of barbarians, he urged, is no longer tenable. It came in as a corollary from the Mosaic cosmogony and was acquiesced in from a supposed necessity which no longer exists. It is without support in the facts of human experience. End of quote. But in Morgan's day, it was not only biblical dogma that supported a belief in the decay of human societies. A bundle of secular anti-Christian dogmas of which Rousseau became the prophet had flourished in the 18th century and created a cult of the noble savage, and that's quotes around that phrase. Defying biblical dogma, these romantic primitivists declared that man, virtuous in his quote-unquote natural condition, had been corrupted by institutions. As Morgan and his fellow anthropologists collected their data on real-life savages, it was hard to swallow Rousseau's romantic notions. Ever since the Renaissance, European enthusiasts for science had promoted an idea of progress. From Francis Bacon's scheme for the advancement of learning in 1605 to the Abbé de Saint-Pierre's observations on the continuous progress of universal reason in 1737, and Diderot's monumental encyclopedia, 1751 through 72. Scholars had proclaimed the inevitable enlargement of human knowledge and the resulting improvement of the human lot. Debate over the relative virtues of the ancients and the moderns exercised the passions of literati and pedants, but the weight of learning was more and more on the side of the moderns. Condorcet's classic sketch of a historical picture of the progress of the human mind in 1793 announced the certain advance of liberty, justice, and equality. Morgan found a way to enlist newly gathered facts from everywhere to catalog the facts of progress. Examples of all the stages, except the, quote, lower status of savagery, which was the infancy of the human race, end of quote, could still be found somewhere. America offered only a first opportunity. Collecting data around the earth, a new science of anthropology could show how, quote, mankind commenced their career at the bottom of the scale and worked their way up, end of quote. The science of anthropology would begin as the science of progress. Before his very eyes, Morgan saw the contrast between the technology of barbarism and the technology of civilization, between communal property and individual property. Karl Marx died before he could write the book he planned to write about Morgan, but Engels incorporated Morgan in the canon of Marxist literature. According to Engels, Morgan had actually anticipated Marx's materialist interpretation, and Morgan's ancient society was as quote-unquote necessary as Marx's Kapital for understanding the history of civilization. Engels concluded his own work on the origin of the family, private property, and the state by quoting Morgan. Quote, democracy in government, brotherhood in society, equality in rights and privileges, and universal education foreshadow the next higher plane of society to which experience, intelligence, and knowledge are steadily tending. It will be a revival in a higher form of the liberty, equality, and fraternity of the ancient gents. End of quote. Praise for Morgan by Marx and Engels discouraged Western scholars from recognizing Morgan as a founder of anthropology. But cultivated Europeans were finally transcending the quote-unquote classical and quote-unquote Judeo-Christian traditions and were beginning to admit the whole world into the family of civilization. And that concludes Chapter 78.